Amitabha. As Chris was growing up, there were many things he and his siblings had missed out on due to their father being largely absent. Chris had no memory of ever having given a Father's Day gift or drawn congratulatory cards in elementary school. He missed out on having a father who would cheer him on at sports events or do the simple, everyday things that his friends' fathers did. Importantly, he missed out on being given wise advice that taught Black children how to survive in an often hostile, prejudiced world. What Chris and his siblings did have was a man who occasionally wandered into their lives, only to yet again drift out of them. A man who seemed to care more about drugs than his family. Over time, Chris became increasingly angry with this troubled man who was a father in name only. When Chris had children of his own, he would protect and love them. But despite his simmering anger, Chris gradually began to view his unsettled parent in a larger context. As he explained, quote, I began the long process of forgiving when I realized him as more than a character in my story. My father was a human being in his own drama, end quote. Yes, the man had greatly harmed his family, but Chris realized that if he was to have any chance of healing himself and helping his siblings do likewise, he needed to understand his father and forgive him. In all likelihood, his father did not decide the first time he used drugs that he would become addicted. Nor had he likely woken up one day and told himself that he preferred being an addict to being a good parent. It was far more likely that he was a man in pain who wanted his suffering to stop. A man who got to that point in life because of his experiences and disappointments. He was not a blank slate who only began making choices at the birth of his son, and whose whole life after that event was a series of decisions and actions based solely on his parental role. It wasn't that he was failing as a father. He was failing as a human being. Once Chris began to see this larger picture of a man whose life was tragically crumbling around him, Chris began to feel sympathy for his father. Life was a gift, one that his father was squandering, after the gift of life was that of learning and growing. Chris hoped for his father to change because he was a human being. And as such, he deserved a chance to redeem himself and find happiness and peace. Quote, forgiving my father meant trading in a desire for revenge for past wrongs, and instead, wishing for the good that can come from changed behavior. I wanted him to change for his benefit, not mine. End quote. Chris wasn't hoping for his father to recast himself into a better parental role model because Chris had already learned the qualities and behavior of a good father from others. He was hoping for the human being who happened to be his father to find himself, hoping for a life not to be wasted. He was able to look at his father and see more than a parent. He saw a man whose life wasn't a tragedy in regards to a singular aspect of a life, but a man whose entire life was imploding. Instead of building a higher wall of anger, Chris began to examine each brick that had gone into that wall. And many of those bricks were related to his father's long-term addiction. Despite commonly held perceptions, drug addiction is not simply a result of weak moral principles or an unwillingness to quit. It can result from a genetic predisposition or ongoing changes in the brain due to previously sustained drug use. And it results from karmic consequences from actions in past lifetimes. As has been said, where there is a result, there must have been a cause. Chris understood and could see that his father was trapped in a web of addiction that he seemed unable to free himself from. This understanding enabled Chris to feel sympathy for his father and to begin letting go of his anger toward him. Like Chris, when we too choose to move beyond our rage and bitterness and endeavor to understand the behavior of one who has hurt us, we also may find our insight deepening. The individual had a life before us, a life in which they found themselves in situations that arose due to their actions in their past lifetimes, as well as the current one. In reacting to all those situations, that individual might have chosen a course of action after carefully considering reasonable options. Or, more likely, they reacted from automatic, long-established habits. Habits that were easy to fall into, but too often unwise. And so the person is now struggling to deal with ever-increasing challenges, loneliness, anger, hopelessness, addiction. Then we come along. We enter a life when the person is already losing ground in the face of daily struggles. Since we don't know what is going on, we can't understand why the individual is acting in such a self-destructive way. But feeling the blowback from their behavior, we react. Perhaps after a carefully considered analysis of reasonable options. Or more likely, from those automatic, long-established habits that are easy to commit, but too often unwise. How do we break this pattern? With understanding and sympathy. Chris came to understand that his father's drug addiction had nothing to do with his son. Drugs had entered his father's life before Chris was born. This understanding gave rise to sympathy for a man who, hounded by his poor choices, was wasting his precious human life. Such understanding is crucial. In It Was a Mistake, Debbie Bakery understood that Ian Manuel was a 13-year-old boy struggling to survive in a poverty-stricken, socially undeserved, crime-ridden neighborhood. With little parental guidance and abundant bad influences, he made a tragic mistake. With this understanding, Debbie felt sympathy for a boy who was told that he was worthless and he would die alone, forgotten, in prison. In Not What She Thought, Yana came to understand that the man who rammed his car into hers did not do so because he was negligent. Learning of the circumstances from the man's son, Yana instantly felt sympathy for this elderly, grief-stricken man, exhausted from devoting every moment he could to his critically ill wife. In being at peace, Jacob, who pled guilty to killing a man, felt that he was the victim because his friends had betrayed him to the police. It wasn't until he could finally step back and appreciate the larger picture that he saw the blindingly apparent reality that the actual victim was the innocent young man he had killed. This understanding led Jacob to feel profound sympathy for the young man's grieving parents, and subsequently, to the motivation for Jacob to transform his life. In each of these accounts, individuals were able to see that they were not the only victim in their stories, not the only one who was suffering. Like them, with understanding, we will realize that before our lives intersected with those of others, those people had already made choices and were either enjoying or struggling with the consequences. Consequences that weren't about us. We need to remember this when others inconvenience, irritate, enrage, or hurt us. And we're tempted to brood on the situation, thus magnifying its importance in our life. By doing so, we can quickly turn an everyday occurrence into a tragedy as we cast ourselves as the innocent victim and the offending person as the villain. This casting closes our eyes to a reality, unbeknownst to us, that the other person may be floundering under the weight of a lifetime of bad choices, while they may end up in the role of an annoying player in the unfolding of our life. They may have inadvertently cast themselves as the hapless victim at the heart of their own story. As Chris said, his father wasn't just a character in Chris's life, but a human being in his own drama. With understanding, we will appreciate that while others may participate in our story as a walk-on player or even a central character, the person is the main character in their own story, their own play. At the risk of overdoing this literary analogy, we all know that life is not a comedy. For many, life is a mixture of drama interspersed with brief interludes of calm and hopefully happiness. Before we became players in each other's life story, we each had our own earlier experiences and happenings, our own history. Choices that affect their futures were already made before we showed up. So while those choices impact us, they weren't about us. They weren't personal. They aren't personal. Those who infuriate, annoy, and hurt us may be contentious actors in our lives. But as writers of our own story, we still have choices as to how it will play out from here. We can choose to continue allowing their actions to impact us negatively, or we can choose to do something very differently from here out. We can reject reacting with anger and choose understanding. The bad choices that they initiated formally have a vice-like hold on them and are unable to free themselves. They continue to suffer. With such understanding, we can then reject retaliation and choose sympathy. They, like everyone, deserve a chance to learn from their mistakes and change their behavior. Our sympathy for someone who has caused us to suffer does not make what we have undergone inconsequential. Sympathy helps us realize that another's pain is equally important to that person and may well be greater than ours. And so they, like us, would be better served with understanding and sympathy, better served with a happier ending to their ongoing story. Amitabha.